Welcome to the Rich, Young, and Powerful podcast. This is the place where we help average givers become everyday philanthropists. I'm your host, Andrew McNair, a financial commentator, author, nine-figure wealth manager, and philanthropist too. I'm going to show you how to give more, how to find more fulfillment, and help you impact the causes that you care about the most. Because when a giver gives more, they receive and become more. Today, I feel honored to bring on our special guest to today's show. We have Dr. Ben Carson, who's a retired neurosurgeon from Johns Hopkins. He's an author, presidential candidate, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So, Dr. Ben Carson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, I can't wait to share about the Carson Scholars Fund. I know that's doing marvelous work over the last decade. But I want to talk about your story because a lot of people may have never heard it before. And I love to ask this question in this way to hear about your story. Do you think you rose to the moment, or did the moment rise at the perfect time?
I think it may be a combination of both. I attribute a lot of the things that happened to me to my mother. So my story really starts with her story. She was born to a very large family in rural Tennessee and was shifted from house to house, never really had a stable location to grow up in, obtained less than a third grade education, and got married at age 13, trying to escape dire poverty. And they moved to Detroit. And some years later, she discovered that my father was a bigamist. And she was then tasked with raising two young sons in inner city Detroit with very little in the way of support. In fact, we were homeless for a while. And then some relatives in Boston took us in. The typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens and gangs. Incredibly big rats. They had something called water rats. I never saw rats like that before. And the roaches were just everywhere. They were ubiquitous. But there was also a lot of violence. We got to know the drug people. They would bring us candy. But both of my older cousins, unfortunately, got caught up in that, and they were both killed. And that was sort of the environment. I remember as a 9-year-old sitting on the ghetto stairs, looking through the building across the street because there was a sunbeam shining through. All the windows had been broken and there was a sunbeam shining through the building. And it made me think about my future. And I vividly remember thinking that I would probably never live to be more than 20 years old, 25 at the most, because that's what I saw around me. Wow. In the meantime, my mother, who was very industrious, was out working 2-3 jobs at a time, going from house to house to house as a domestic. She did not like the idea of being dependent on the government. And she figured if she worked long enough and hard enough, we'd be able to move back to Detroit. And after a couple of years, we were still in a dilapidated, horrible area with plenty of wildlife, but nevertheless, she was independent. And I was not a very good student. In fact, that's a major understatement. I was the worst student you've ever seen. And then we happened to be tested for our vision. And it was discovered that I could barely see. I didn't know anybody could see. I just thought that's the way the world was.
I just thought everyone's blind.
And when I got glasses, I said, wow, I can actually see the board. And I went from an F student to a D student, and I was just delighted. But my mother was still very disappointed. And, she prayed to God for wisdom because both my brother and I were doing poorly. And God gave her the wisdom to observe those homes that she was cleaning and see what those people were doing that made them successful. And she concluded that they didn't watch a lot of TV and they read a lot of books. And she came in and imposed that on us, and we were not happy campers, I can tell you. In today's world, we would have called social services on her. But, we had to read the books, and I didn't like it much, but the fact of the matter is we were desperately poor. And between the covers of those books, I didn't have to be poor anymore. I could go any place. I could be anybody. I could do anything. I started reading about people of great accomplishment, entrepreneurs, explorers, surgeons, scientists. And I began to understand something very important as I read their lives. And that is that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. And, I just stopped listening to all the naysayers, just threw that stuff right in the garbage and started thinking about what I could do. I became a bookworm. If I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. I was always reading. And in a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all the people who were calling me dummy, who were now coming to me saying, how do you work this problem? And, it was a major, major transition for me. But I still had a significant problem, and that was my temper. I would fly off the handle and wreak havoc, and I would be so angry that I didn't really care what the consequences were. And, it led to a lot of very difficult situations. But perhaps the most dramatic one was when I was 14 and another teenager offended me, and I had a knife, a large camping knife, and I thrust it into his abdomen. And fortunately, under his clothing, he had a large metal belt buckle. The knife blade struck and broke. And that was sobering to me.
That was scary for both of you.
It was very, very much so. I had turned things around academically, but I realized at that moment that I would never become a doctor with a temper like that I would end up in jail, reform school, or the grave. And none of those appealed to me. And I just prayed. I said, Lord, you got to help me. I can't deal with this temper. And there was a Bible. I picked it up and turned to the book of Proverbs, written by Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. And there were all these verses about anger. And then there were all these verses about fools. And it seemed like they were all written about me. And after a few hours...
all of us, yeah.
Exactly. After a few hours of reading and contemplating and praying, it dawned on me that the reason that I was so angry was because I was selfish. It was always about me, my, and I. Somebody did this to me. Somebody's my space. I want this. And if you could let it be about other people and just step out of the center of the circle, you wouldn't have that problem. That was the last day that I had an angry outburst. Never bothered me again since. And people who know me now, they can't believe that I used to have anger problems. They say, gentle Ben? How could that be? But it was.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the Lord's work in your life. And I love this tradition of praying for wisdom like your mom did. And then you pray for, victory over anger. And I think that's just beautiful. And I think there's another great takeaway is so many times we talk about philanthropy and giving. And, a lot of times people think, well, giving and philanthropy starts with your own family and that given to a family legacy and inheritance. And I just spoke with a couple this week and they were so adamant about putting away $60,000, $100,000, $150,000 for this child by the time they were age 18. And I thought, my story about reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad at the age of 14 and how by the time I was 19, I'd already saved up $147,000. I tried to share with them that you don't want to just ruin your child. You want to make it easier for them, but you can actually ruin them. And your mother was so wise in that she's not trying to put money back for y'all. She was trying to give you education so you could find and navigate your own path in life.
That's exactly right. And she was also a wonderful role model when it comes to something you're familiar with, finances. She could stretch a dollar further than anybody I've ever seen. And, she would take us out to the country on Sunday mornings and knock on a farmer's door and say, can me and my boys pick 4 bushels of your corn or tomatoes or whatever? 3 for you and 1 for us. Well, they always like that deal. And then she brought stuff home and canned it. She would go to the Goodwill, buy stuff. And by the time she got done with it, people would say, where'd you get that? I want one of those. She sold her own clothes. I mean, wow. She was an amazing person, and she was always observing people. And her philosophy was, if they can do it, I can do it too. But I can do it better. That was what she always thought. And that's what she always said to me. You can do anything anybody else can do, but you can do it better.
Dr. Carson, did she lead you to the Lord, or did someone else in your life lead you to God?
Well, I grew up, listening to the stories in church, and they were very meaningful to me. But the thing that really led me to God was the incident that I told you about. And God is so amazing. He took the knife out of the hand of an angry teenager and gave him back a scalpel to save lives.
The irony in that, that's divine intervention. I mean, there's no way of looking at it any different. Do you think that's the time where your life really shifted from just looking at yourself to becoming more and giving back to your community? That was the moment. That
was the moment that I started thinking about others. And that is really the key. And that's why with the Carson Scholars Fund, the component of academic achievement is very important, but of equal importance is the component of humanitarian service, of caring about other people, because we're trying to develop leaders for tomorrow. And we don't need people who are just smart. I mean, Hitler was smart, Marquis de Sade was smart, but they didn't really care about other people.
True.
And it makes a huge difference. And research has shown that if you get a person to start thinking about others at a young age, that continues throughout their lives.
I think that's great. I would love for you to unpack Carson Scholars Fund and what y'all actually do and the mission behind it, how it began. I'd love to hear the whole story.
Well, it really started because I was going to a lot of schools. I was speaking at a lot of schools. And the first thing I would notice when I walked into school, this display with all these trophies. All state this, all state that, champion of this, champion of that. And there was really such a huge celebration of athletic achievement. And I don't have any problems with that. I'm glad to see it.
Right.
But what about the academic superstar? What recognition did they get? Maybe a National Honor Society pen, a pat on the head, they're their little nerd. Nobody really cared but much about them. They didn't get any kind of recognition. So we said, that's probably the reason that we rank number 21 out of 22 in science and math in countries around the world. They said, we can't just complain about this, we have to do something. So we started figuring out how we could make academic achievement and caring about people cool. And we decided that we would start with 4th graders, because that's the time when kids, develop to the point where they can start thinking about the future in a complex way. And we would give them $1,000 if they achieved at a certain level. They had to have at least a 3.75 grade point average on a 4.0 scale. And they had to demonstrate more than 6 weeks ahead of time that they cared about other people through some of the projects and innovative things that they were involved in. And not only did they get the money, which is put into an escrow and developed for them until they go to college, but also they get a medal, just like a gold medal that go around their neck. And the school gets a trophy with their name on it to put right out there with all the sports trophies.
I love it.
They get to go to a banquet. We had a banquet the weekend before last in Baltimore, about 1,500 people. We have a banquet this weekend coming up in California. There was a banquet last week in Tennessee. And we celebrate these young people. And we also usually honor an adult and give them an opportunity to talk to the children. We've had a lot of interesting people like Bill Gates Sr., Colin Powell, General Krulak, who was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, a number of Nobel Prize winners, cabinet secretaries, Laura Bush, a lot of people who have spoken to the kids and inspired them. And this is really what it's all about. And we have now given away over 11,000 scholarships. The other component to the program are the reading rooms, because reading was so important to my development. And as you probably know, if you can get a child reading at grade level by third grade, it completely changes the trajectory of their lives. Their likelihood of finishing high school and going on to further success is significantly enhanced. And these reading rooms are the kind of places that will really get kids engaged. And we generally get the parents involved in helping to design the rooms. They frequently have the flavor of the place where they exist. Like there's one by one of the capes for space launches that's shaped like a space capsule. You know, look through one window, you see the Earth. You look through another window, you see the moon. Another one, you see E.T. And they have kind of books that really grab young people. They want them. And they have very comfortable chairs and lounging facilities so that they can just go in there and get lost. We've had some kids who just said, "Can I stay here?" Because it was so much better than their home environment.
I just love it because, fourth grade, just very similar to your story. It's around the same age that you had that turning point in your life. And I think one of the habits that you have is your self-awareness that you've had at a young age. And I think that even is just blossomed when kids have a chance to finally read and become more self-aware of their situation. And I just love the attention to the root issue. Like, there's so many issues we could try to fix in the world, but a lot of times it does stem from these children that have had a bad start. And if we don't right the ship by third grade, it is a very ugly trajectory that they're probably headed on. And I also think that it matters what we appreciate, what we put our attention to, because what we appreciate appreciates. And so if you say, hey, instead of, it's great that you're an athlete, but it shouldn't be a distraction for our country that all of the attention is on the Super Bowl, which is great that these athletes are showing their gifted abilities. But at the end of the day, it's a distraction from the real issues that our country, and it's a real distraction from things that really matter, like faith and family. And we don't need modern day gladiator games for our American empire. So I just love all about the Carson Scholar Fund.
And we also have some wonderful teachers that we always acknowledge at our programs, because I've never seen someone who's successful who couldn't point to a teacher that played a significant role in that. And, I can remember when I was in high school, I was in band. I played the euphonium, the baritone, and I was pretty decent at it, to the point that I was offered a scholarship to interlocking. People in music know what that means. And obviously I would have been the first one in my high school to ever get such a thing. And it would have been a big feather in the band teacher's cap. And he said, "Benny, don't accept it." He says, "Because you're going to be a great doctor and I don't want you to get distracted."
Wow. Those mentors in our life that, definitely make a lasting impact like that. Now, I want to hear about littlepatriotslearning.com, but in just a second, I want to take a detour, like your life could have went on. What would you say to a young resident, maybe at Johns Hopkins, to encourage them to make the most of their life like you have?
I would say, learn how you learn. Everybody learns in different ways. And the sooner you figure out what works for you, the further you go. If you have to spend, an excessive amount of time learning something because you're using somebody else's pattern as opposed to yours, you're wasting a whole lot of time. And that was something that I discovered, my first year in medical school. I was very happy. I said, I finally got through the last hurdle. I'm in medical school. And then I did terribly on the first set of comprehensive exams. So badly, I was sent to see my counselor, who encouraged me to drop out of medical school. He says, wow. You're not cut out. You're not cut out to be a doctor. And you're just going to torment yourself and everybody else, and we can help you get to another discipline. I was devastated. And I went back to my apartment and I just prayed. I said, Lord, help me to figure this out. And I just started thinking, what kind of courses have you always done well in, and what kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized I did really well in courses where I did a lot of reading, and I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures, because I don't get anything out of boring lectures, nothing. I'm just like wasting time. And I was sitting there for 6 hours a day, wasting time. So I made the executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And, years later, when I went back to my medical school as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. Because so many people are just negative. And they can always find reasons why you can't do something, but they don't seem to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how you can.
It's so true. Like I'm re-listening to How to Win Friends and Influence People. And we all know those single moments where people gave us an affirmation. They gave us one compliment that we use that as fuel and jet fuel for a decade. And so we do all need to be careful about when we say something negative, because it sticks with us and makes us doubt, when otherwise we can become a renowned surgeon. So I think there's a lot of takeaways right there. I'd love to hear this, and this is really hard to make it concise, but if you could write one tweet that would be read by everyone about education, to point people to the Carson Scholars Fund, what would you say in that tweet?
I would say, remember that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not someone else. It's not the environment. It is you.
That's so powerful. That's so powerful. I love this story. I think I'll give credit to Jim Rohn, but he says, there's two children that one says, I have an alcoholic father and there's just no way I could ever succeed. You don't understand. I've just had a tough life. I grew up with an alcoholic father. But the other one says, you don't understand. I had no choice but to succeed because I had an alcoholic father. And they both had the same, shared, experience, but one obviously said, what, I'm going to make this my jet fuel to have a turning point. So I think that's great.
Right. And that was my mother too. I mean, she did not believe in excuses. I mean, if anybody could have said they had a rough life and need an excuse, it was her. She did not believe in excuses. And she wouldn't let us have excuses. And if we ever had an excuse for something, the next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. And we didn't want to hear that poem, so we stopped making excuses.
Dr. Carson, I'd love to hear, because there's probably a few of these, but I'll try to narrow it down. Do you have a strong belief about education that really isn't shared by popular culture, or a strong belief about the education system here in the United States that isn't shared by popular culture?
Well, I strongly believe that there should be accountability in education. How can you have a school system like the one in Baltimore? You might have seen the story a couple of months ago. They looked at 23 public schools, elementary, middle, and high school, thousands of students, to see how many were able to work math at grade level. 0. Now, that's a systemic failure. That's not because the kids are stupid. So obviously, no one is being called on the carpet for a systemic failure. And that's happening all over our country. And the population is suffering significantly for it. And what happens to us in the future when we have to compete against China and other countries? We'll not be able to do it. We'll not simply be able to do it because we only have 330 million people. They have 4 times as many people, and they're educating them better than we are educating ours. We're setting ourselves up for disaster.
You know, I love comparing our current education system to just 100, 200 years ago. And you think about the people that came out of our education system at the founding fathers. And what we see is also that there is not this huge separation between faith and the teachings that they had. A lot of their teaching was based on a moral and biblical background as a foundation. And I think that's another reason why is we've pulled God completely out of the school system, which has consequences. And that's probably very controversial, and many people disagree with that opinion of mine. But are there some comments?
It's a good opinion because reading was taught from the Bible. And when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1831, because the Europeans wanted somebody to study America because they couldn't figure out how a country barely 50 years old was already competing with them on virtually every level. And one of the things he noted was the superior education system that we had. He could find a mountain man, and the guy could read, and the guy could tell him about the Declaration of Independence. It was very interesting. And if you look at one of the 6th grade exit exams from the 1800s, I think most people would be just flabbergasted what they were expected to know.
We might even fail it. That's the scary part. It's just, you think about our founding fathers. I mean, Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, and you'd be hard pressed to say we have people that are coming out of our education system today like that. And it's just incredible. And that's why I want to hear more about the littlepatriotslearning.com. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, well, in response to all the indoctrination that's going on, we felt that you can't just complain about it. You have to actually do something about it. That's why American Cornerstone Institute is called a think tank / do tank. We actually do stuff. And we created an internet learning program, K through 5, which looks at the values and principles that are foundational to our country, and also all the history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But the fact of the matter is, you take an objective look at our history, there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And you have people like CRT and 1619 that just take the bad and ugly and try to build everything around that and try to characterize us that way. The fact of the matter is, we have an amazing nation, and we have people who come here from everywhere. From England, from Germany, from Africa, from South America, from China. Doesn't matter where your ancestors came from, you're probably better off here. And, we all built it together, and let's learn from the mistakes and move forward. But let's build on our success, not on anything that was a failure. And those are the kinds of lessons that we try to get across to the kids. We're not each other's enemies. We do better when we work together. What are the kinds of things that led people to success? How were they able to share that with their fellow Americans to make it into a better place? All of those kinds of things are in our Little Patriots program. And we have these beautiful cartoons in our Star Spangled Adventures. We hired some of the best talent from Disney and Pixar non-woke talent, by the way, to create these incredible cartoons, which have workbooks associated with them and are extremely well done. They're up for an international award right now. And, basically, we just want to take advantage of the fact that our young people are like sponges. And what does the Bible say? It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it, in Proverbs 22:6. But remember that our adversaries also know that. And, Vladimir Lenin, what did he say? He said, give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted. And that's why they're so anxious to get in our schools and indoctrinate our kids.
Well, I love that you're on the offensive and playing more than your part to give back. And
I forgot to mention one very important thing about Little Patriots. LittlePatriotsLearning.com is 100% free because we have gotten underwriters across the country who understand how important it is to get the right information to people.
That's amazing. Now, I do know this show is all about giving and philanthropy. What advice would you give to encourage others to give more, and how can they give towards Carson Scholars Fund?
Well, I would say recognize that the direction of our country is not good right now. There are a lot of bad things happening. And we have an opportunity to save it, but we have to be active. And if we're only concerned about accumulating stuff for ourselves, that's not going to help. And in the long run, if we turn into another type of nation, socialist or communist, you're not going to have that stuff anyway. So why not use it now to make sure that doesn't happen? That's the way I kind of look at it. And also,
that's amazing.
When you do things for others, that is the best feeling. I remember a few weeks ago, I was in the airport, and a man came running up to me. And he said, Dr. Carson, I'm sure you don't remember me, but 30 years ago, you operated on my 3-year-old daughter. She had a malignant brain tumor. Everybody said she was going to die. And last week, we celebrated her 33rd birthday. There's no money that's worth that.
No. That's beautiful. I think if we're not careful, we'll be too busy complaining versus contributing. And that is what it's all about. If we want to, right the ship for this country and we want to make a change, we can't just talk about change. We can't just complain about these young people without getting our hands dirty and without digging in our pockets to try to help fix the problem. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing. Again, how can they find more information one more time about the Carson Scholars Fund? CarsonScholars.org. And there's an abundance of material there. And LittlePatriotsLearning.com. Either one Amazing.
of those.
Well, I really appreciate you having spent some time with us sharing your heart for education and sharing because you've already shared most of your life dedicating it to service to this country in more ways than one. So I really appreciate you coming on our show today.
It's been a pleasure, and please continue the good work you're doing. Thanks for being a patriot.
Thank you, sir. That's all we've got for this episode of the Rich, Young, and Powerful podcast. One thing that would really help us both out and others to find more information on the Carson Scholars Fund and the other great organizations that we spotlight on this show, all you have to do is go to iTunes and Spotify and leave us a 5-star review. Also, be sure to check out my new book, The Giving Crisis, which you can pick up on Amazon and tells my story from being greedy to generous. And also check out the Everyday Philanthropist YouTube channel to learn about ways that you can give more today. And I talk about questions that you have about tithing and giving, and I answer those on the podcast as well as on the YouTube channel. So until next time, remember that when a giver gives more, they receive and become more. See you next time.